haven't had cleared yet. Those areas are now being taken over by our exotic species that we brought into our landscapes. So examples of these exotics that were brought over, most of you are probably familiar with these, at least maybe one, if not all of them. Common buckthorn is, just as the name implies, very common, a huge problem in our landscapes, brought over to be a hedge species, which it does very well, add privacy to people's properties. Burning bush is one that has been modified to be somewhat sterile in some of the new cultivars, so it is still being sold in the landscape trade, which is unfortunate, but usually what happens is they end up cross-pollinating and continue to spread into our natural areas. And it's one that's really popped up, I would say, within the past decade or so, that I've really started to see it in our natural areas and be more of a problem. The same with barberry. That one has been huge, especially in Waukesha County, that I've seen it in our natural areas. And autumn olive, and I believe autumn olive actually kind of originated in like the Cedarburg area. A lot of these plants too were told by the DNR to farmers to plant as hedgerow species. Other ones that we have too, like our multiflora rose, like they have berries, they're good for the birds, they have thorns, they'll keep your cattle on your property, and they've just gone crazy now. So these are just a few examples. There's more out there though. And the problem that they do is they reduce our biodiversity of our natural areas. Once they escape our formal landscapes, they spread, they reproduce, they leaf out early. So they are the first species to leaf out because they're not tuned in with our native plants and the correct time to leaf out. So they're leafing out early, which is affecting our spring ephemerals. They're getting shaded out earlier than they would with our native canopy, and then they're dropping their leaves later. So the best time to find some of these species is by when everything else is starting to change color in the fall. You will see the buckthorn will have its green leaves, just like this example. So you can really pick these plants out pretty quickly in the spring and the fall because they are the first ones to leaf out and the last ones to change color if they do, or just to drop their leaves. So those are kind of the best times to identify those species. And they're also not just invading our woodlands, they're also invading our grasslands, which is then affecting our grassland birds, which are already in peril because we've cleared a lot of the prairie because it's nice fertile soil. So we've farmed that and gotten rid of it. And now we have another threat. And this is basically creating a food desert for our bird species because now they only have one species to consume for energy, and it's not really a good energy source. And that's all they have because all of our native vegetation has gotten taken away from them as a food source. And I hinted at the berry nutrition. There's been a couple studies done about this. I don't know the nitty gritty of it, but they are showing that the studies of the European or exotic species have more energy, more sugars sometimes, but they don't have the fat content in addition to that. So what happens is in the fall, when all these berries are on the landscape, birds are heading south for the winter. They are basically just consuming candy to try to get south, and they're not getting the fat, the protein, the energy reserves that they need to make those long distance travels. So they have to stop more, which is slowing them down. So it's just not a good situation. And it's just kind of, if you think you're just eating a bunch of candy, you give those kids that sugar high, like they think they're going to be able to withstand that for a long period of time, but then they usually crash. And that's what's happening to our birds. And the ones that are overwintering here, it's not enough fat to get them through the winter when all those berries are gone. And then they really are struggling because there are no native berries out there to help them. And they don't have the fat reserves to sustain those snowstorms, even though our snowstorms are becoming fewer and far between, which is another issue and another topic for another day. So with that decline in our native species, we're losing our host plants. And if some of you may not know what a host plant is, that is what caterpillars in the Lepidoptera family, so moth caterpillars and Butterfly caterpillars are the #1 source for birds, and those guys eat our native plants, and they have formed a relationship over thousands of years with these plants that those are the only plants that they can consume in their larvae stage. And if we lose those plants, we then lose those caterpillars and lose those adults. And it's just a big chain reaction, a big snowball effect, and that's where we're seeing a lot of decline. So this is just a short, brief list showing some of the host plants of shrubs that we have and the species of Lepidoptera that consume those plants. And so, like I said, if those cherries go away from the landscape, like chokecherry, we have the potential to lose over 400 insects and caterpillar larvae, bird food from the landscape. So we really need these plants on the landscape in addition to our native shrubs, or native trees, but we're focusing on shrubs here. You also have probably heard this very staggering statistic that we've lost almost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. Multiple factors for this, but one is you can't have a family if you don't have family food to raise that family on, and birds pretty much exclusively feed their babies caterpillars. So if we don't have the caterpillars because we don't have the host plants, we don't have the adult birds in our landscape. And like I said, there's other issues with that too: predation, feral cats, and window collisions. And like I said, starvation during migration is another big one. When they have those exotic berries, is the only thing on the landscape that they have to consume. So that was the sad part. And now we're going to start getting into a more encouraging portion of the talk. So I'll try to move fast through the sad part. Most of us know a lot of those negative things that exotics are having on our landscape. So ecological benefits of our native shrubs. We have food, shelter, and nesting. So we're going to talk about food first. So like I said, insects, caterpillars, those are the big thing that they're feeding their young in the spring when they're rearing their family. Chickadees, if you want to learn some amazing facts, research Doug Tallamy and his students have done on how many caterpillars that chickadees need. And that's just a fairly small bird. If you start to think about some of the bigger birds, how many additional larvae that they need to feed their babies. So they will eat other insects, they'll eat spiders and moths, but they prefer to especially feed their young the caterpillars because they're nice and juicy and squishy and full of protein. So it helps those little chicklings grow pretty quick. But they will also eat berries. So service berries are one of our first fruiting shrubs to go to fruit in the spring, early spring or late spring, early summer. So that feeds about 40 bird species with those berries. So that's a good one, thinking about, feeding the adults in addition to feeding the young of the birds. And so then in the summer, they're still consuming some insects, but now we're starting to get more berries in the landscape and they're starting to switch over to those. The fledglings are leaving the nest and they're starting to consume berries as well. So buttonbush will start to ripen late summer. Pagoda dogwood is a really great one if you like the thrush family of birds. So bluebirds, robins, the thrushes, those guys all really go after dogwood species. So I know I have a fairly decent sized dogwood in my yard and I had like 7 or 10 robins in it once those berries start to ripen. So it's really cool to see them really flock to those species and prefer those. And elderberry is another really good one for birds that a lot of people grow for human consumption, but you got to beat the birds to them to consume them. And then when we go into fall, this is where the seeds and the nuts of our shrubs start to really ripen. And that's where a lot of that protein is packed into those seed capsules. So this is where we're starting to get a lot of that, like a plethora of food source in the fall when migration is happening. So there's a reason that we have more nuts and fruits available in the fall. So these are a few of those shrub species, the chokeberry that I mentioned earlier. Sumac is a really great one that is a late winter food source. So they don't really prefer those berries as a first option, but they will do that when there's nothing else left in the landscape. So like getting into right now, this time of year is when you'll start to see birds going after sumacs and the glossy chokeberries. But, we have other species too. Junipers, the waxwings really like the juniper berries, and viburnums as well. So then talking about, that was the food source portion, and now we're talking about nesting. So this is a picture of a bald eagle nest that I came across a couple years ago. They're nesting way up high in the trees. They want to have a nice overlook, nice view. They got to see that prey that they're going to go after along rivers and water sources. And so they're nesting way up high up in the top of the canopy. And then if we come down a little bit lower, we get the Baltimore orioles and the ruby-throated hummingbirds. They're nesting kind of in the canopy. They want to be more protected and shielded. They're not way up on top like the eagles are. And moving down even further into the more of our eye level, we have goldfinches and sparrows that are nesting kind of in that 5 to 6 foot range. And then we also have birds that nest on the ground. So we have a wide range of where birds will nest. It depends on where they have found their niche to survive and be most productive with their clutches. And they will also nest in invasive species. So they don't really have a preference. They're not searching out a specific plant to nest in. They're looking at the structure of it. And unfortunately, sometimes those invasive species provide that structure that they need. So here is a list of different heights that birds will nest in. So some of them have a pretty big range. House wrens will nest a foot above the ground to up to 30 feet above the ground. The main takeaway here, whether it's cavity nesting or cup nesting, which is like I showed in that buckthorn picture on the previous slide, is they actually build their own nest out of grasses and twigs. That's a cupped nest. So they're nesting in that 5 to 20 foot range, and that is about the height of most of our native shrubs. So a lot of birds, and this is again just a select few, will nest in that preferred height range off of the ground, and that's for predation, security, and then also protection from the elements. So we need to have these shrubs in the landscape, because if we don't have anything in that height range, they don't have a space to raise their nest or build their nest and raise their young. So how do we start to incorporate these species into our landscape? One thing that we have overlooked, I think, in a design perspective is the 7 layers of a landscape. We have our climax trees, our canopy trees, and then we have our mid-story trees, our shrubs, our perennials and herbs and grasses, and then we have our ground layer. So we have multiple layers of landscape, and this allows us to put a lot of species into a small space. And because they're different species, they can coexist and commingle in a small space. Their root structures are different. They're looking for different nutrients. So we can actually compact a lot of species into a small space. And this is where we've kind of lost it. We've put in our specimen tree and mowed our turf grass underneath it and put up a fence for privacy. So we've eliminated a lot of that 7 layers where we need to get that back into our landscape for aesthetic reasons. I know we can make this stuff really beautiful, and also for wildlife and for the benefit of living with the land and not just on it. So here's an example of a way to use edible gardening and making a shrub hedgerow. There's a lot of these plants that are not only preferred by our bird species, but also by ourselves. So this was a client where we put in a bunch of edible shrub species. Nannyberry is probably my favorite, and it is one of the few viburnums that so far has not been affected by the viburnum leaf beetle. So we're still planting it in the landscape. It doesn't get defoliated. One of the really sweet berries in the fall. So I really like to put that one in where I can. Elderberry, running serviceberry if you have a drier site, and then also glossy black chokeberry, which is pretty universal. You can plant that in a lot of different types of ecosystems. So these are a way to get those plants back into the landscape, give yourself privacy, and also use it as a food source. You can use it as a specimen planting. Some of these mid-story trees like the pagoda dogwood or serviceberry, you can use those as a specimen planting if you want to have that focal point in your landscape. These are really nice trees that they're shrubs, but they are almost more like a tree in structure. So they can be used in multiple ways in the landscape. I kind of mentioned privacy hedge too. These are arborvitae and common 9-bark. So we can use diverse species, not just a single row of arborvitae. We can put in other shrubs as well to get that diversity back up and also create privacy for our lands. And also for restoration, this is probably a pretty obvious one, but when we're restoring our land, when we're trying to heal the land that has been degraded, shrubs are a great way to start getting that structure back, start getting food back in the landscape, nesting spots, and start to heal the land. Button bush is a really good one for those wetter sites. So I'm going to try to, okay, we're doing pretty good for time. Try not to get too bogged down in a lot of the details here. This is where I start to go off on tangents with looking at specific plants. So I will try to stay on track. Last time I gave this talk, it ended up being like an hour and a half, and I felt really bad because I just kept talking. So I'll try to stay on topic, but there's so many good plants. And I really think that they all provide a great thing for our landscape. So I'm starting with some of the shorter species, and I think I have them organized as they get taller. So lead plant is a really cool one. More drier sites, if you have that. I guess I should also explain on the slides, I have the sun and moisture level identified on the bottom, and then if it's attracting birds, bees, or pollinators, that's up in the top right corner. So if you have specific goals for your landscape, you can kind of look at those for which one of these species you should put in. But lead plant, it takes a little bit to get established. I would give it like 3 years before it will actually flower in your landscape. So it's a little bit slower growing plant, but it's really nice for those smaller gardens that we have where you don't have a lot of space. Still provides a lot of benefit to the landscape ecologically, and also it's just such a beautiful plant with the silvery foliage, with the compound leaves there, and then gets these bold flowers with purple and then the orange pollen, the stamens. So it's just a really great, interesting focal point. Like I said, stays pretty short, 2 to 3 feet tall. So and this one, you might want to cut it back in the fall, but this one you want to keep going because it grows on the old wood, just like a regular shrub would. So yeah, and it's very drought tolerant. The name lead plant came from the fact that the early settlers thought that it grew only where there were lead deposits in the ground. I think that's been debunked, but that's kind of where that name comes from. St. John's wort, there's a lot of different species, so kind of watch your heights on that. And there's also some cultivars of this species, but kind of if you can go with the same straight species, that's best. But they can get a little tall, 3 to 5 feet tall, and they're pretty much the same spread. So if you want something to replace your spireas, this would be a great alternative because it's got that same great big mounding habit. Doesn't need to be pruned back or sheared back. And if you leave it in the fall, you get these nice coppery seed heads that will really contrast with any snow that we do get. So a really great mounding habit. It can spread by seed. So if you want to have a more formal landscape, you might want to, in the fall, kind of cut off those seed heads before they fully mature. But the seeds are also a food source for our birds. So we want to, if you can, keep those in the landscape as much as possible. Tolerant of many soil conditions. Like I said, this one's very drought tolerant. Deer and rabbit resistant. I would, use that with a grain of salt because you can't always guarantee that these shrubs are going to be deer and rabbit resistant. They prefer less of them, but if they're hungry enough, they may still nibble on them. But once you get them established, you should be good. And the bees just love this plant. This is always one that's a quick one to go to if you were looking for some bee activity in the summer, because it's always full of them when it's flowering. Another one that I use pretty regularly is dwarf bush honeysuckle. There are, again, some cultivars of this one as well in the trade. It can tolerate a lot of different variety of soil conditions and sunlight and moisture. Likes to be a little bit on the drier side, but can also tolerate some moisture. One of our few short shrubs that will go in the shade. So if you have a shadier location or have some foundation plantings or sidewalk plantings that you want to put in, this would be a good shrub to put in there. Hummingbirds love to go after this because it has nice little tube flowers, even though they're not red. And it gets nice dense foliage. It can be sheared. People use this in a lot of our urban landscapes because it's salt and drought tolerant. And then they shear it, and then you get these red, the new growth is red. So like you see in the picture. So if you want to encourage that, you can shear it back, but you don't have to. Each year you'll get that color along with the flowers. It is a native honeysuckle. It is not an invasive. So don't let that common name fool you or scare you from using it. You just want to make sure that it's the Daravilla species that you want to look for. Chickadees and a lot of our wintering birds that hang out here for the winter will use the seeds for a food source. So it's a good all year round, and it will sucker and kind of spread and fill in. So kind of be mindful of that. Doesn't go super crazy, but it will start to sucker, especially if you shear it, it'll send up new growth. Glossy black chokeberry is another really good one for a lot of urban sites. It's typically found in the wetland in nature, but it does tolerate drier sites. Again, there's cultivars of this one that will stay shorter if you wanted to go that route. This is one that the berries are really astringent, very high in antioxidants. And every year I think that I'm going to be able to tolerate eating them. And so I always try, and they suck all the moisture out of your mouth and just like hit you. But they're very high in antioxidants, really good for you medicinally. And why that's good in the landscape is that because they're not favored by birds when they're ripe, they're favored by birds after they go through a freeze-thaw cycle. So just like I said with the staghorn sumac, the glossy chokeberry is a really late season berry that birds will consume. So right now they're going to start going towards the glossy black chokeberry shrubs and eating those berries. So winter interest, they're on there all winter long. And right now is when they're starting to get picked off. So if you want to have that winter interest in your landscape, this is one where the berries will stay on for most of the winter. Red osier dogwood, this is one that can get big, but you can also prune this one back pretty easily to keep it in its compact state. Really great winter interest with the red stems, really good bird food with the white berries that it gets in spring and summer. So you can use this one if you want to keep it pruned back. You can cut those branches off and use it in your winter bouquet decorations. Or just leave it in the landscape and just enjoy it. Just a really good shrub. It does keep its form pretty well. Again, it's more of a wetland plant, so it tolerates if you have like a downspout area or a wet spot in the property. This would be a good one to put in, but it will also handle drier conditions as well. Typically found in full sun, but if you put it in shade, you may just get fewer berries, but you'll still have that benefit of it being a host plant in shade. Common ninebark is if you are familiar with bridal's wreath, one of the spirea species, this is a good alternative as a native plant. Just gets beautiful arching branches that cascade with flowers. Mine are just loaded with bees of all sizes and shapes during the spring when they're in flower. Really gorgeous blooms. Gets decent fall color with some yellow in there. There are also cultivars with reddish or other colored leaves. And I tend to tell people to stay away from cultivars where they start to change the leaf color, because then the insects can't identify that. There's something chemically that goes on that they don't see that as a potential host plant. So if you want to go cultivar route, try to stay with plants that have the same leaf foliage and the same flower color. So there are a couple 9-bark species out there that have different leaf color. I have one of those in my first years of gardening that I planted, the Diablo 9-bark, which has a reddish color. And I will say that even the pollinators, I don't see as many on there as the true native species. So there is something to be said about cultivars and natives and nativars. So try to stick with the true species if you can, but I also understand that all of our landscapes can't accommodate some of these larger shrubs. But like I said, this one is just loaded with pollinators in the spring. And then one thing that's also cool about this plant is it gets its name 9-bark from the exfoliating bark. So if you think of like birch trees, how that bark kind of peels off, the common 9-bark kind of does that too. So there's two thoughts that the way that it peels back, it curves and looks like a 9. I don't really see that. And also another one was that there's 9 layers of the bark that exfoliates. So I'm not exactly sure which one is accurate or how you want to handle that. But what happens with that exfoliating bark is that offers an opportunity for chickadees and juncos to store seeds in there. And so they start to cache their little seeds in there from your bird feeder or from your prairie area. And then they come back during a snowstorm and those seeds are nice and safe in that bark. I will say when we got this snowstorm, I had a lot of juncos in my 9-barks. So they must have stashed some seeds in there and we're coming back for them because everything else was covered in 6 to 8 inches of snow. So that's a really nice, interesting way to also provide kind of a storage system, a pantry for the birds as well. I mentioned pagoda dogwood. It's a really great shady tree that you can put in. That's a shrub tree, can get tall, 15 to 20 feet tall. So it does get a little bit more tree structured, and it has these really nice horizontal branching that's loaded with flowers. You can get away with some sunlight, but I would avoid putting this in a spot that gets southern exposure or western exposure. If you would put it in one of those places, you might need to do some supplemental watering during our drier periods. And you might get some like leaf scorch and some leaf drop early. It needs to have that good moisture because it's a woodland plant, so it wants to have that nice organic moist soil. Again, like I said, the thrush family, robins, bluebirds, those guys all really love these berries, and pollinators go after it too. Buttonbush, this is a really great restoration plant. Again, there's a couple cultivars that are smaller in size and a little bit more compact. So those are ones that they look very similar. So I would say you could get away with using those in the landscape and still have that ecological benefit. Again, the bees just go crazy for this guy. And then those white flowers turn a crimson color when they start to ripen and the seeds start to form. And then that's when the birds go after them. So they are consuming the seeds of these guys. Really good for wetland plantings. So if you have a wetland on your property that you're trying to restore, or like I said, a rain garden area, this would be a really good plant to put in there. This is an example. You can't see the pond behind, but this was along the pond of a client of ours, and the milkweed, swamp milkweed is growing in there. Lobelias are growing in amongst it. So really good way to get those 7 layers in along a wetland area and really get those high diversity plantings in. So then we have hazelnut. This is one of my favorite because it has really great fall color and really cool fruit when it starts to ripen. So it has the catkins, which are the male pollen flowers. Those are consumed by birds kind of now, this time of year, right before they start to open. The twigs will be used by birds. The nuts are obviously consumed, and it's a host plant. It's really dense, so it's good for nesting. So it just has a really good wildlife value. It can also get a little tall. So this is one that we'll use for restoration projects or for privacy if people have that need along their landscape. Rabbit and bunny tolerant, I will say, more so than resistant. I've had bunnies eat these guys down when they're really young, but the good thing is if you can protect these from browsing for the first couple years, usually they will bounce back. So if they do for some reason get eaten down by a deer that comes through your property, they will come back and start to resprout after they have a good root structure. So it's really only pertinent and vital to the plant to keep them protected from browsing during their first year or two that you put them into the landscape. When they're nice, young, and tender, that's when the rabbits and the deer are going to go after them. So this is some detailed pictures of the hazelnut. Again, it's one of those really interesting plants to me. You can see in the left picture, those are the catkin, that's the hanging down. And then on my ring finger, that is the female flower. So it's like one of the tiniest flowers. And it's just one of those true signs of spring for me. Is when the catkins start to elongate, you can see the pollen blowing in the wind. Usually like late March, early April is when we'll see these start to ripen. So this is when I've been out wetland monitoring, this is my first plant to go look for and see that it's blooming and opening up in the landscape and bringing everything to life after a long winter. And on the right is the flower or the leaves starting to come out and just the different coloration on them. It's just a really cool plant, one that I probably spend too much time looking at in the spring. Juniper is probably one of our few evergreens that we have in the landscape that are native, that will do well in urban landscapes. So arborvitaes tend to get consumed by deer pretty easily, so you have to do a lot of protection with those. Junipers are pokier and less likely to be consumed by deer. So they're one that I usually go towards if people want an evergreen for year-round privacy or year-round specimen plant. There are male and female varieties, so you need to kind of be a little careful. Some will have berries and some will not. So kind of like buckthorn, if you're familiar with that, only the female plants produce berries. Same with junipers, and we don't really have a good way to identify whether it's a male or female when it's younger. So until it gets to fruiting age, that's when we can see it. So you might want to put in a few and you'll hopefully get at least one female in there. Like I said, cedar waxwings really go after these. There's a lot of different cultivars. So if you want to do a low growing one, you have low growing cultivars. The one thing I tell people is just to always look at the Latin name and make sure you're getting Juniperus virginiana versus, I think it's Chinensis, is Juniperus chinensis is the Chinese juniper. So if you want to try to stay as close to native, but go for a cultivar, make sure you're looking at the Latin name and you're getting a cultivar of at least our true native juniper species. We also have a low growing juniper too that is native, that will spread pretty big, but stay less than 3 feet tall. But these guys are pretty tough. Once they get established, they're really drought resistant. And like I said, evergreens are really good for the landscape because they do provide really good shelter in the winter for birds during snowstorms and even during rainstorms in the summer. We just don't have, our area isn't, we don't have a lot of true natives for our area here. And we don't have to stop with shrubs in our landscapes. We can put in other things in our hedges. We can put in perennials. This one's got Joe Pye weed and big blue stem. So there's a lot of different things that we can do. We don't have to just, this talk is focusing on shrubs because I think it's a layer that we're missing. But like I said, that 7 layers, we can put in a lot of plants in a small space. So don't think your property is too small to get a lot of plants in there, a lot of native plants, because you can do a lot when you're planting with diversity. And most of you probably already know this, but messy yards are healthy yards. So try not to clean up too much in the fall if you can, or at least leave a portion of your yard to be messy. This is a really good spot for those overwintering insects. And, we're trying to encourage insects into our yard. So if we put in the native plants, their host species, but then in the fall we clean up all the leaves, we're most likely getting rid of all those insects, and they have to start all over in the spring by new species or new individuals coming into our landscape, where if we leave the leaves, we leave the dead wood, those insects are probably overwintering in some form, pupae, or as adults, they're overwintering in those leaf litter, and then they can just come back in the spring, wake up when temperatures are right, and then they're right back and ready to go to town and use our plants. So messy yards are healthy yards. Putting signage up is really good too, to help educate your neighbors on why you're doing it and leaving your leaves. I think people are starting to understand it a little bit more now, but there's always going to be people who are grumps about it and want you to clean up. So signage is always really good. I know I put a couple of signs up in my yard a couple of years ago, and I still get people who just kind of read them as they're walking by. So I'm hoping that I'm spreading a little seed in their direction and encouraging them to do the same thing. So with that, thank you all for listening. And then I do have, I'll leave this slide up for a little bit, maybe while we do questions. These are some resources that I have found really helpful, and sending to clients as well. The first three are books. So there's the Shrub and Woody Vines of Indiana and the Midwest. So it's not specific to Wisconsin. We're kind of on the northern range, I think, of it. But there's a lot of plants in there. They have really good photo in the book, so it's easy to identify things, really good descriptions. Bringing Nature Home, any of Doug Tallamy's books, most of you have probably already read those. Another one, Sarah Stein has a good one, Noah's Garden, talking about regenerating our landscapes. And so she has a lot of good diagrams in there and just a really easy read. And then there's also Native Plant Finder. If you guys are not familiar with that, you can just put in your zip code and it will tell you what plants will grow in your zip code area. And then you can just select it from there. And they're also, this is one of Doug Tallamy's students' projects, I believe. They're putting all the host plant associations with it. So if you want to say, I only want to plant a couple of shrubs and I want to do the most that provide the most host plant options in our landscape, you can just whittle it down that way. And so then you only plant 3 shrubs, but you're providing for 600 plus insects. So I think that's a really cool resource that they're putting together. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Danielle. I learn something new every time that you give a talk. And so thank you. I really enjoyed this talk in particular. Wanted to also mention, I said in the chat that all of these shrubs are available at our online native plant store, which is now open. And this is kind of why we had Danielle come on, because we want her to, let people know why we are so interested in planting native plants. I feel like it's a thing that we need to do to help everything on this planet. I think we're all starting to come to the realization that, man can't live by himself or herself. We need everything on this planet to support us and let us thrive. So native plants are a big part of that. There were a few questions. I don't know if anyone else has any other questions. We have a lot of time to talk about maybe even a specific shrub or something if you had a question. So we have plenty of time here. Don't be afraid to ask a question.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you want to get started on those ones that we had.
Sure. Let me just quick look through here. All right. We had any recommendations for what to pot up in from winter jug sowing? Someone did a lot of milk jug sowing. I think that's great. I did that one year and I was so impressed by how good of germination I had. You can, so if I understand the question correctly, you're asking what to do with all those seedlings. So you can divide them up into little plug trays if you have those available. Otherwise, what I did is I just let them keep growing in there and get a little root bound, and then you can kind of pull them apart and then just plug them right into the ground. So you could if you wanted to take the time to actually pull them apart, I don't have the patience for that. But you could do that. I would keep them protected even once you get them into the plugs, into those bigger trays, keep them in dappled shade or shade just so that they don't dry out. But if you let them grow a little bit more, I've just taken them and just kind of divided those up into like 8 or 10 little groupings, and then I just plop those into the planting bed that I was putting them in. So yeah, you can do that. I would, yeah, if you wanted to take the time and plot them into the plug trays, and then maybe even if you wanted to go up a little bit bigger, you could do that too. Aaron asked, are any of these poisonous to pets and dogs? From my understanding, no. But I would say be cautious, and definitely if you put one in, maybe keep an eye on your pet to make sure that if they do nibble on it, because some of them, they may not be poisonous, but they may be an irritant. The one native plant that I know of for sure that is bad for dogs is the baneberries. So anything in the Actea family, there's black cohosh, red baneberry, doll's eyes, those are all perennials. That's the only one that I believe is listed on the ASCPA's website as poisonous to dogs. So that's usually one that I'll keep out if I have a client with pets that are in the landscape. But off the top of my head, no shrubs should be poisonous to them. And then Lori asks, what's the name of the short juniper? That is Oldfield juniper. I believe it's Juniperus horizontalis. So it's a really nice one. It's a little bit softer too than the upright juniper when you touch it, but still gets berries. It's going to be more of a low ground cover though. I would use it as instead of more of an upright specimen as a shrub, but still really good for slope stabilization because it can kind of root itself in other areas, so it will kind of spread that way. So if you have a steep slope that you want to stabilize, it would be a good one for that. Any native shade-loving evergreens? That's tough. The one that comes to my head right now, which isn't great for our region, but it is a native to Wisconsin, is the hemlock. Eastern hemlock would be good for shade. That one kind of likes groundwater seeps, moist conditions. We do plant it in our landscape down here. It's just not always tolerant of some of our heavy clay soils, but it would be one that you could try. I think that's the one true like shady one. Pines, white pine might do okay, but that's usually going to want some shade or some sun, full sun as a sapling at least. Yeah, we're not great in our shade in our evergreens on southeast Wisconsin, but I think hemlock would probably be your best bet. Yews are too, but I don't think that there's any of our native yews in the nursery trade. I think all of the yews that are out there are European. Any other questions? And it can be, if you want questions about the plant sale or something else, it doesn't have to be shrub related.
Yeah, come on, people. We got Danielle. I feel like we don't want to waste this time.
So me and Joanne are like exploring the like hedging to like keep like the chemical sprays off. Like what can you share about incorporating shrubs? Like we have a lot of silver maples, but in the shade of the trees or working in rows, would you do it? I don't know, just some ideas about that.
Yeah, most of our native shrubs are edge species. So that means they are that transition zone from open prairie, full sun to shade woodland. So they will tolerate shade, they will tolerate full sun. You'll, like I said, with the red osier dogwood, you're going to get more blooms if they're in full sun, but they also want that moisture. So they do kind of want that shade. So you can kind of, like most of the plants I talked about will tolerate the shade of a silver maple. That's kind of nice about maples is they're a little bit more our native ones at least, are a little more dappled sunlight. They're not the dense shade of like a Norway maple. So the hazelnut, the 9-bark, even elderberry, like those guys would all do well underneath a silver maple or within that zone. If you have like a row of silver maples, they're not going to have, like, you're going to get the morning sun potentially and then afternoon sun. So you're going to have different times of the day that you'll have sunlight for those plants to have.
I have a question.
Yep.
I have a very large silver maple that's was planted by a neighbor on the property line, and that is an extremely shady area. But a few years ago, I planted a snowberry because I knew that it would tolerate shade, and it does, but there's not enough sun for it to bloom. Therefore, I don't have the advantage of the berries. It's been in about 4 years. I'm wondering if I dare think about transplanting it. I put in a snowberry last year. I started a new native shrub bed, and now I've got ideas for other things. So this has been a great discussion. I put one in there, and it did flower and had berries because there's more sun for it. So what about transplanting that snowberry, or do I just enjoy the foliage and the thickety, low mound of shelter that it's providing?
Yeah, snowberries tend to sucker. So if you wanted to, I mean, depending on the size of them, sometimes they get, after 4 years, I'd be a little hesitant on trying to move it, just for the fact that it's going to take a lot of effort on your part to get a good root amount out of it and move it without shocking it too much. But what they do is they'll send up little suckers. So if you could find, like, maybe from the base of the plant, if there's like a stem coming up a couple feet away, you might be able to cut that off and then maybe put it in a pot so you can kind of really nurture it and keep it watered and let it build up its roots, because you just severed it from its parent plant. And then you could transplant that. I would say I would go that route versus trying to transplant the whole shrub, especially if you're okay with it not blooming and still providing that habitat that it is, even though it's not giving you the berries. Or maybe just try one. If you got a couple of them there, try one to transplant and see how it does. Whenever you transplant something, though, you're going to have to water it a couple times a week. Doing it in either the really early spring, if you can, or in the late fall is a good time. So don't do it in July and August when we're going through our drought period. Doing something, usually transplanting stuff, we'll wait until into September when we have cooler temperatures, more moisture in the soil, and it doesn't evaporate as much. And then it may go dormant and look dead, but it usually comes back in the spring.
Thank you.
What I can also do, Maggie, is prune some of the lower silver maple stuff. If it's over your property, you have every right to trim it back so you could get more sun that way.
I've been doing that, much to the neighbor's dismay, but the tree is probably 40 or 50 feet tall at this point, and I do keep the large limbs that are coming over the roof off. And when I do that, when I have that done, and obviously I've got to call in an arborist to do it because they're out of reach. They used a lift last time to get to them. And that lets in some shade for a little while until it starts to form its canopy again. But anyway, I don't want to remove the tree because I know the benefit of the maple, and it's not my tree, I don't think. Anyway, it's staying. So it's a woodland garden space, and I just, I'm appreciating it and enjoying it that way.
Yeah, and if you already have another space where you've been putting in shrubs, I would just keep expanding that space, and use the silver or the sugar maple as your woodland area.
Thanks again. This has been a great morning.
Good. Maureen had a question about what's a good shrub for birds in winter, something for cover and inclement weather. Yeah, the evergreens are kind of the best bet. I would think something like a 9 bark also, they're pretty dense as a deciduous shrub for cover. I can't say I've ever seen birds really like truly protected in there. But I think 9 bark would probably be one of the denser ones in winter still. Hazelnuts get a little bare, but they might also be one that a lot of our woodland or our shrubs, like they'll sucker. So you kind of get that dense vertical branching, so that can provide them some cover. Yeah, I would say 9 bark and hazelnut would probably be my two. Not too many of them are marcescent, that they keep their leaves on during the winter. So that's where I would go. And then the last question in the chat is the best way to propagate native shrubs. Species like wetland species, such as the, like we were just talking about, the snowberry, the dogwoods, red osier dogwood, silky dogwood, willows, all of those. I didn't talk about willows, but those can all be cut and then just stuck right in the ground. Doing that in the spring or the fall, probably the spring would be better. I don't have too much experience doing that, but if you cut a branch and if you just stick it in the wetland soil, again, moisture is key, keeping the soil moist for those. But if you just take that branch and stick it in the ground, they will usually root themselves. So you can easily propagate a lot of them. And usually if you have them on your site or you're getting them from someone, you're not spending too much money on them. So if they don't all make it, it's not too much of a financial loss. So those species you can easily just cut and stick in the ground and propagate them that way. I don't have too much experience with propagating, so I can't say which ones are easy to do by seed. Some plants, they need to go through the digestive system of birds before the seeds are actually viable in growing, which is an interesting evolutionary phenomenon too. And that's why buckthorn is a diuretic for birds, because it doesn't want to stay in their digestive system. So it's like a natural laxative to them. So that's why they end up pooping it out pretty quickly. And so that's another reason why they're not a good food source for the birds, because they actually kind of wreak havoc on their intestines. But not to say, I mean, you can always try collecting fruits and nuts. I would say the seed ones are probably a little bit easier than the nuts and fruits, but again, I don't have too much experience with propagating. But yeah, I think like the dogwoods, elderberries, doing the cut stems, willows I know are really easy to do with that. You can just cut those and stick them right in the ground. You can also divide some of them, like I said, with the snowberry. If they're starting to send out the suckers, you can sometimes divide them that way. Or like I've seen red osier dogwoods, when they get really big, they start to arch, and then those arching branches will touch the ground and they'll actually root themselves. So then you can cut that branch off and dig up that root. So it's similar to the live staking that I was talking about. It's just sticking the stick in the ground. They kind of nature did it itself, so you can propagate it that way. Yeah, I guess I go not cheap way, but the easy way of just going and buying them. Oh, you're muted, Joanne.
Sorry, I was trying. I still can't believe it. It's only been an hour. So I really thank you again for coming today. Does anybody have any questions about the plant sale? I mean, as long as people are on chat, can you answer any questions about that?
I hung the posters and distributed some bookmarks around Gateway, so they know.
Thank you. I did all the libraries yesterday, so.
Oh, nice.
I covered all the Kenosha and Racine libraries. Oh yeah, Danielle is giving her contact information if anybody wants to contact her with any questions, but yeah, thank you all for joining us today. It was good to have this discussion, and I hope that you all shop at the store. And oh, I just wanted to mention that if you would like to join our chapter, that we're always welcome to have more people participate in our chapter. I think it's a good one. And also, it's still not too late to join the plant sale committee. And if you do, you get a 20% discount. So I just wanted to mention that if anybody wants to sign up today to become a Wild One member. Otherwise, everyone stay warm and dream about summer and native plants. Thank you again, Danielle. I learned a lot today. It's always great to hear from you. So
Thanks for inviting me again.
Thanks.
so
See you.
Thanks, Danielle. Great to see you.
I don't know if anybody from the chapter wants to stay on to discuss chapter. You're welcome to stay on if we have any questions about chapter news or anything. And anybody that doesn't want to listen to that boring stuff can sign off. I don't know. What do you say, Regina?
I don't know. Do we have I'm not sure that we really have a lot to cover right now.
So, okay.
Is there another plant sale meeting? I'm trying to get together a presentation for March. That'll be much more depressing because it's on invasives.
Yeah.
And I kind of wanted to do that in person, but I don't know. I'm still working on that. I was hoping maybe we could go to the Kenosha Library again or something.
That'd be cool. Yeah.
Okay, well, I guess I'll just end the meeting. If anybody has any questions, you're free to contact me too. I'll put my contact information. Oh, it's a com, so sorry. So enjoy your weekend.
You too.
Thanks,
You too.
Joanne.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks.